Welcome to Arizona Roundup with Stuart Rosebrook at Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona. My special guests today are Paul Hedren, Paul Andrew Hutton, and Paul Fees. The three Pauls have joined us here today in Prescott, Arizona, coming in from near and far, from as close as Prescott, Arizona, Cody, Wyoming, and Omaha, Nebraska. Yes. All trails lead to Prescott, as they have since we were founded as a territorial capital in 1864, and we are bringing the history roundtable together here today. I hope this is the first of many roundtables of the three Pauls. And what brings us together here today is a good friend of all of ours, Marv Kaiser, the former president of the Board of Trustees here at Sharlot Hall Museum. And Marv had the great idea that he should invite our special guests here, Paul Hedren and Paul Andrew Hutton, to Prescott to help promote their new books. It's a very special year for everyone in the Western history business, and we're going to talk about your writings, your careers in history. Paul Hedren, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
We're glad you are here, and we hope it's the first of many visits. And Paul Fees, a long walk over from Sharlot Hall's apartment this afternoon.
Oh, it was exhausting.
And but back from Cody, you spent some Christmas time with family in Cody.
We did. Long drive up, short drive back.
Well, that's good. And Paul Andrew Hutton, it's good to see you again. Just twice in the 6 months. I saw you in September up in your new beautiful hometown of Cody, Wyoming, as the interim curator of the Buffalo Bill History Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West.
It's great to be here in Prescott. Of course, when I heard that Fees was coming to Cody, we immediately left town. Been on the road, but alas, here he is.
He hung on long enough to get a ride to the airport.
Oh, I did. Yeah, actually, I had to buy him lunch though to get that. He was best man at my wedding in the Poker Church in Cody, and there's a story connected with that too.
Well, we might get to that sometime today.
Yeah. As we go down memory lane here. Yes.
Well, one of the last night we were at the Westerners Corral of Prescott, one of our cornerstones of supporting Western heritage history and publishing here in the community. And Paul Hedren, you brought to the table this year, this is your latest book, Sitting Bull's War, The Battle of Little Bighorn and the Fight for Buffalo and Freedom on the Plains. It is published by a fine publisher, Pegasus Books out of New York. Mm-hmm. And Paul, you presented last night on The Undiscovered Country, Triumph, Tragedy, and the Shaping of the American West. And your publisher is Dutton Books out of New York as well. And so, as noted recently, we are in a banner year for Western publishing. And we've had a few valleys over the last decade in which we've had some noted historians, such as yourselves, publish with publishers out of New York, so this is really something to celebrate, and I think a culmination of many, many years of research and passion. And Paul, are you from Omaha originally, or has that become your adopted hometown?
Yeah, no, it's an adopted hometown. You marry an Omaha girl and you go to Omaha. That's the way this works. I'm a Minnesotan and have spent a career with the National Park Service all over the West. I started at Fort Laramie in 1971 while still in college, and went back when I completed college and was hired permanently, and I went from there to western Montana to the Big Hole Battlefield and was there as their park historian for a couple of years, and went to the Golden Spike site in northern Utah, was there for 5 years, went to Fort Union in North Dakota, the Fort Union in North Dakota at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri River. Different from the New Mexico Fort Union, yes. An American Fur Company enterprise from the early 19th century. And was there for 11 years and moved then to Nebraska and ran rivers for the last of my career, 2 wild and scenic rivers in Nebraska. When I was hired for that job, having a history background and history sites in my career and a history interest anyway, my boss said, you're not going to like this job. It's a political job. They don't like us in Nebraska. It's, a new park creation, and when new parks are always tough starts. And I loved it dearly. I was there for also 11 years. And you make friends one at a time. There's a little history at that place, too. And I found it and enjoyed it. But the river resource was just absolutely wonderful. I was a writer all this time, too. And but when you have a working, you got a day job, you do that at nights, and you do it on weekends. And my wife was a teacher, and when the kids and the wife go to school, I could take, especially in winter in North Dakota, you could take some extra days off, and I would write in that time. And I got to the end of a career and just decided that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And so I found this home in Omaha and have been there now for almost 20 years and writing this kind of stuff.
Well, and the central location has had to have been, and it sounds like you've made this big circle across the Great West, being born and raised in Minnesota. And I think that brings, when you read your books, you bring the land into your story. You have lived on the land, and you have brought that to your writing.
I work very hard at that. I'm very proud of that. I'm a geographer. Growing up, my family was very well traveled, and we traveled coast to coast and had these extraordinary long vacations. And always was interested in history, both Minnesota history and history of the West. And my family, my father particularly, just fawned over that. I mean, he just, he did everything to be encouraging. As I'm growing up and imagining what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, my parents' best counsel was, well, just got to end up in Seattle. That'll be fine because it'll give us a place to come and visit. And so I just had this broad horizon, and I pulled it off. I mean, I made this work for me.
Well, and here at our roundtable here today, one of the things that brings us all together, I believe, is Cody. We talked about that a little bit here at the beginning of the show, and that this intersection, and I have to think that Robert Utley is also part of that story. And, Paul's talked about, when I went to Cody in September, for me, it was like a pilgrimage. When I saw Paul for the first time, and I was walking with my wife.
Which Paul are we talking about?
Paul Hutton. Paul, you were here. I missed you and Cody on that trip. Next year, we'll have to have you up there at the same time for the Western Writers America Symposium. But as you talked about your work across the West with the National Park Service, Robert Utley, of course, came to mind. Mm-hmm. And with Cody, this location for this greatest Western museum, maybe the greatest museum in the Western United States in terms of rivaling the Smithsonian for its collections and for its mission. And all three of your careers, and Paul Hutton, your career from being in Albuquerque for 40 years has now brought you permanently, or at least temporarily, to Cody. But you've had pilgrimages to Cody well before that in pursuit of your research and your craft.
I would say that the Buffalo Bill Center of the West is the greatest Western history museum in the world.
I don't think we can disagree with that.
Very good. I didn't like that. Yes, I went there first in 1968, graduated from high school. Two buddies and I piled into a Volkswagen bus, broke down immediately as we were leaving town, and headed west. Their goal was Las Vegas, Nevada. Mine was Custer Battlefield, as it was called at the time, the Black Hills, and Cody, Wyoming. I wanted to see the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody, Wyoming. And so I went there, and I just went, wow, this is incredible. And then I went to graduate school. I went to college first, and then to graduate school.
In Indiana. You were raised in Indiana, correct?
I lived part of my life in Indiana. I'm a German orphan, and came to this country on the boat in 1952, and traveled around the world. My dad was in the Air Force, and we wound up in Indianapolis, which was his hometown, and so that's where I went to high school, and then I went to Indiana University, and worshipped at the altar of Bobby Knight, who was there at that time. And then
I worked with Martin Ridge there.
And I worked with Martin Ridge. And at that time, Western history was still very, very strong at all the major universities in the country, and it's slipped some since that time. But I certainly had Oscar Osborne Winther was there.
Oh, Winther, is that right? What a byline.
Who Robert Utley got his master's degree under, and at Indiana University, and that was the connection. I met Bob when he came to give an address and get an alumni award, and I said to Martin, "Oh my God, I want to go to the Indianapolis airport and pick him up, and it's 60 miles away. It's going to give me 2 hours in a car with Bob Utley." And it was very exciting, and that began a great mutual friendship. And he was not only my mentor, he was like a father figure to me. And of course, he had many proteges, especially in the National Park Service, and Hedren was one of them. Jerry Green was another, just many. And he certainly inspired my career. And it was funny in my career, Martin Ridge was a bow-tied academic, very serious. He was the editor of the Journal of American History, which I worked on as a graduate student, and that was, and still is, the leading historical journal in the country for American history, and trained me as an editor, which is what I did. I worked, my first job was at the Western Historical Quarterly in Logan, Utah, at Utah State University. And Martin always wanted me to be just like Martin and be a very serious academic, and so I was a huge disappointment to him. And although he tolerated me. I think he actually loved me as a wayward child, And Bob was the other influence. I mean, you're just too academic, kid. In fact, I sent my dissertation to Bob after I'd finished it on General Phil Sheridan. I was sure Bob was going to just tell me how absolutely brilliant it was and just start working on my Pulitzer Prize speech. And he sent it back to me and said, "This is just awful. You're so academic. It's so boring. I could barely stay awake reading this thing." He marked it all to hell. It looked like Custer's last stand after the battle. And so I retreated into a fetal position for about 2 years. And then I came out and rewrote it just like he suggested. And published by the University of Nebraska Press, was actually a huge success. It won the Organization of American Historians Best Western History Book Award. It won the Western Writers of America Spur Award. So I'd hit that balance between solid scholarship and popular history. So it's a very readable book. I'm more readable now than I was back then, and that's because of Bob Utley. And I really kind of followed in his footsteps, and he was a historian who managed to balance the requirements of the academy and the seriousness, of our profession as historians, with an understanding of it doesn't do you any good to write something if no one reads it.
Right. Most definitely.
No one reads it. Yeah. And he never had the kind of success that he wanted to have. He was always grumbling about D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and how, it was such a blockbuster. He didn't write that well. I didn't. Well, D. Brown wrote really well. And I got to know him really well, too, in my career. He was a wonderful man. But Bob had great success as a scholar and paved the way for, the books that both Paul and I have written that we're talking about today. No question about it.
So, Paul, your trail to Prescott today starts at University of Indiana as an undergraduate. Paul Hedren, you started at?
Oh, I was destined to become a history teacher in Minnesota, and one of the state schools in Minnesota. And a different course, a different light, a different spin here, and that's where I'd probably still be. But again, we were a well-traveled family and got to the parks all the time, got to Custer Battlefield all the time. I understood well what park rangers, and particularly the summer rangers, you saw. And I think my parents are the ones that said, well, gee, you could do one of those kind of jobs in the summer. You'd be a school teacher all you want in the winter, but do that. And I fell for that. And I tried very hard to get a job at Custer Battlefield. I never got a job at Custer Battlefield. This is just one of the great disappointments of my life. I was offered the superintendency of the park at a time in my life, but was married to a woman who did not want to move to Montana. And so, she went to Kansas City and I came too. I came to O'Neill, Nebraska.
Serious career mistake, because the wives go away, but the job, you know.
Oh, listen, the job was the job. Heaven's sakes, I could have done this and would have loved this to death. But the guy then you learn to court people, and how do you get a job? Well, you go meet the guy that hires the park rangers. And I did that and met the guy at Custer Battlefield. This is now back in my young days. And I introduced myself, and I said, well, you know, I'm a serious Custer student. I mean, I can carry on with anybody, I believe. And I think I'd be just right at this place. And he agreed. And he says, I'd love to see your application next year. Now I'm in my second, third year of college. And I spent that whole year boring my friends in St. Cloud that this is where I'm going to be next summer. You come out and visit me. I'll be in Montana at Custer Battlefield. I'm going to be a park ranger. And I didn't get the job. And I was just crestfallen. And I went out on my annual swings through that part of the world, which I had been making since high school, and sought out the guy that I thought was going to hire me, and he was gone. And the guy that replaced him, he says, well, I don't know why the hell he didn't hire you. He did all the hiring. I inherited, you know, his decisions. But you should ask him yourself. He's at Fort Laramie, Wyoming. He moved to Fort Laramie. Well, I wasn't planning to go to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, but I did. And I sought him out, and he remembered me. And he said, well, I don't know why you didn't get a job at Custer Battlefield. That guy did the hiring. And so you learn very quickly about double talk. And he says, but give me your application next year, and I would be delighted to see it, and I'll get you a job. And I did, and I got that job at Fort Laramie, which led to a career.
Which I believe is a wonderful National Historic Site. It's again, one of those places when you drive around the corner in your park and you step on the ground there.
Oh, you're
walking where history's happened.
Absolutely. You know, founded in 1849. It was an American fur company post before that, and the military shows up there. The Oregon Trail, the Pony Express, the Transcontinental Telegraph, everything passes there. 500,000 people westbound passed that place in its time. I was at Custer Buff. Well, Custer was never there. I was so disappointed by that. But Crook was, and all the Indians that I have studied all my life, Buffalo Bill was there. And you learn that very, very quickly, and you just get enamored with that. And so that's, you know, kind of one of these little directional devices that sends you down your way.
Now, Paul Fees, we're going to bring you into this conversation here. Paul, your trail from Arizona to Brown and back, I think you have an interesting story as well that brings you back west. And we heard last night a little bit about Paul's inspiration, what was sparked his light, you know, brought him into the Western history, the popular culture of the West, and Davy Crockett. I'm going to ask Paul Hedren that question here after a break, but I just want you to leave us with a little touch of what brought you from Brown out to Cody, and then we're going to take a break and thank our sponsors. Then we're going to hear a little bit more details about how your road went from Arizona to California to Brown and then back west.
Okay. We can talk about Moby Dick in between.
We sure can. With that, Paul, we're going to take a quick break to thank our sponsors, and we're going to come back with the three Pauls here at Sharlot Hall Museum on Arizona Roundup.
Since 1995, Helkin & Horn Ad Agency has helped local businesses stand out and succeed from print and radio to websites and social media. You see, their talented team crafts your brand's message and offers a plan to get it out into the community. Do you want results backed by 30 years of experience? Visit AZAD, that's azadagency.com, and do it today. Helkin and Horn, where their slogan is Be Known.
Since 2007, Pinion Painting has been transforming homes and businesses with over 40 years of first-hand experience. They bring superior craftsmanship and an eye for detail to every project. making your vision a reality, hassle-free. Your time is precious. Trust Pinion Painting to get it right the first time. Visit Pinion Painting today and let them transform your space. On the web at pinionpainting.com. That's pinionpainting.com.
For over 45 years, Blind Brothers Arizona has been the heart of window style in Prescott. From blinds, shutters, drapes, they will custom design and install with expert precision, tailored just to you, whether it's for your home or your office. You can trust the name that locals rely on. Visit blindbrothersarizona.com today or call them at 928-776-1845. Once again, that's 928-776-1845 for a free consultation. Blind Brothers Arizona, the original since 1979.
Welcome back to Arizona Roundup with Stuart Rosebrook at Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona. My special guests today are Paul Hedren from Omaha, Nebraska, Paul Andrew Hutton from Cody, Wyoming, and Paul Fees from Prescott, Arizona, and Cody, Wyoming. And we've talked earlier today about what brings us all together around this table. And our special guest in the audience is Marv Kaiser, who is really responsible for bringing us together today here around the table, or round table here, talking about Western history and Western heritage and what inspires us. And in the break, we heard a story, I think a story that is emblematic of what draws us to this part of the country, what inspires us about writing about it and its people and its culture. And Paul, will you share us a little bit more about that day you drove into Fort Laramie?
Well, I had already known Paul Hedren and had many stories of his about what a great place it was. And I had never visited. I'd lived in Wyoming for a while. I was out and about, probably on some sort of business trip. And I drove into Fort Laramie early in the morning, just after dawn, probably early spring. And it was empty, nobody in the parking lot. Drive across an old iron bridge to get in there. And in fact, you get the sense that the bridge was there at the time of the Indian Wars.
It was.
And the morning was cool and clear, and fog was rising from the river, and reveille started over the PA system at the fort. You couldn't see anything, but you could hear a bugle call, really haunting bugle call, and an eagle swooped down over the parking lot. It was transporting, and there are many moments like that in my life, at least in the West, that made me believe in time travel.
And the fact is that you made a home in Cody, not necessarily like all of us. Some of us moved somewhere and we think we're going to be there a while, but you made a stake there in Cody, Wyoming. You raised your family there, and you became a very important part of Western history and heritage as a curator at the Buffalo Bill Museum. When did you start working in Cody, Paul?
I started in 1981. That was my first job out of graduate school. And I was in my department. I was at Brown University in the American Civilization program. And in my department, I was the designated Westerner. So anything that happened to come into somebody else's hands that dealt with the West, they'd stick it in my mailbox. One of the teachers there, one of the professors, who was also a museum guy, he was the director of the Slater Mill, which is the first water-powered mill in America, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, by the way. I want to say that right. Put a notice from a museum hiring leaflet, aviso, in my mailbox, had it circled. It said, Curator, Buffalo Bill Historical Center. Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. 5 years museum experience necessary. I was on the next to last draft of my dissertation. And I told him that, gosh, you know, I don't have 5 years museum experience, but he said, I give you 5 years museum experience in 2 weeks. You're going to play. Well, they hired me, and so Nancy and I drove cross country with our Basset Hound and settled in Cody. It was not exactly the kind of job I thought I was looking for. In fact, my thesis advisor, when I told him I'd gotten a job at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming, he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." But it turned out to be a great decision for a lot of reasons, not just career, but life.
And from Cody, which for many of us, I grew up in Los Angeles, California. Cody was as far away as any place. You know, I'd like to say that our family travels went two directions, was back and forth between Phoenix and Los Angeles and Central Arizona, and then my father decided that we should go to see family in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia. Those were our vacation spots. And so as an adult, I'd keep checking off these boxes of places, you know, and put the family in the car, and my wife and kids were game. And what's interesting, though, is that Cody, Wyoming, being at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, you also, though, remained part of the greater Western history community. That Buffalo Bill Historical Museum was very involved with Western Writers of America, Western History Association, and the leaders of Western history and publishing in the 80s and 90s and 2000s.
Well, it's true. We were very active, and as you say, at the center of things. Published a magazine, in fact, called American West. I don't know where that title's gone now that
I remember that book. I remember that magazine.
It was
it's like Persimmon Hill out of Oklahoma.
Oh, it was even better. In its day, it was a serious magazine, and later became kind of a glossy travel rag. But it was a fun thing to have associated with the place. We published a lot of books. I was just thinking about one the other day that we did for the Wyoming Centennial and the Territorial Centennial in 1990. We put together, because of a gift that had come to the museum, Wyoming Territorial Imprints, which sounds boring as hell, but we had a librarian who loved doing that kind of boring stuff. She put together a comprehensive checklist, a real contribution to scholarship.
It is, indeed.
And I wrote a preface or an introduction for it. Anyway, I wondered the other day about that book. I wondered if there was anybody who had ever bought it. I've got a couple of copies at home. Hedren seems to have a copy.
Yes, I know exactly
You
what
gave
you're
me a
talking
copy.
about.
I must have.
Yes.
I may even have signed it. I don't know. But anyway, I found one copy on the internet for $199.
It's now a rare collectible.
Well, we must have published and printed at least 60 copies. I don't know. But yes, we used to do a lot of really important, not necessarily popular, but important stuff for the profession in those days.
Well, and I think that that's a role that here at Sharlot Hall Museum, as we look at Sharlot Hall's career, trying to stay closer to, not trying to go far afield, but reestablishing ourselves here at Sharlot Hall as a museum that does publish, but publishes, a little closer to the vest. And we do hope in the next couple of years to republish Charlotte's poetry and to reestablish, I think, her importance in Western history and her role in literary history and leadership in the Western United States in her era in the late 19th and early 20th century. Paul, were you a fan of the popular Buffalo Bill, Cody, before you found yourself working at the museum? I know that we have a Davy Crockett fan here at the table, and we all can point to certain places. And I want to hear from you also, Paul Hedren, to hear about who inspired you as a boy. But Paul Fees, were did you, I mean, we know that you love Herman Melville and his great works, including Moby Dick, even though I think Bartleby the Scrivener doesn't get enough attention.
I agree.
Who was it as a child that you remember in your boyhood? Was it on TV? Was it on television? A comic book? A young book by Scribner that inspired your Western reading?
When I went to work for the Buffalo Bill Museum in 1981, my mother said, "How can you go to work for a place that celebrates a guy that wiped out the buffalo?" No, I hadn't been a big Buffalo Bill fan before that. I'd read about Buffalo Bill and had a higher opinion of him than my mother did, and had certainly visited his gravesite, but before getting that job, I'd never been to Cody, Wyoming. When I was a kid, actually, my big inspiration was Davy Crockett. I mean, there has to be a whole generation of us Western historians who were of our age, who were riveted by Disney's Davy Crockett. And I got to sit at a table about this size. We were at a little oval-shaped table here, and have lunch one day with Fess Parker. I heard Paul Hedren talk about getting his comic book signed. I didn't have the presence of mind to get anything signed or to have a picture taken or anything like that, but I never seem to remember that we carry a camera on our belts now. But it was Davy Crockett, and at the time, because my father had been called back into the Air Force during Korea, and the mad hatter of the Strategic Air Command wouldn't allow his skilled flight crews to retire. Anyway, we were living on an Air Force base near Austin, Texas, so went to San Antonio frequently. And the Alamo was on our radar even before Disney. And when it suddenly had that narrative, that fabulous Disney narrative to go with the place, it became magical. So
I think that's remarkable. I love the fact that you told that story about Davy Crockett. I think that he is definitely an American hero of real and imagined that has brought a lot of us to this table.
And he and Kit Carson are both mentioned in Moby Dick.
Isn't he? And there's a wonderful museum connection to young Paul Fees wearing his knickers and going to the Alamo.
Paul Hedren, tell us up there where in Minnesota did you grow up? I don't think we know that.
Well, I was born in New Ulm, Minnesota. Attacked twice in 1862.
There's some sort of deadline we're obviously breaching here.
This is outside us.
Well, you can edit that out, right? So
I think was there a little bit of an alarm going off here in the building?
That was in the building.
It was my phone.
No. Was it outside? It was your phone.
No, it was something.
Oh, it's right there.
I guess I should have turned it off.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think mine's over here. I don't know that it's off. We'll find out.
I don't know how to turn it off.
From Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, we bring to you Paul Hedren.
I grew up in Olivia, Minnesota, a little farm town west of New Ulm, where I was born, west of the Twin Cities, 100 miles. My father ran a grain elevator. It was in the middle of the Dakota Uprising country, so just south of there, 16 miles, was the Birch Coulee battlefield, an important site in 1862. My Boy Scout troop would go down there regularly to camp, and while my colleagues, my friends, were fishing and chasing little birds and butterflies, I'm out there looking at the monuments and just adoring this stuff, and just could imagine exactly what happened here on that day in August 1862. That, in addition to this travel we've been talking about in my world, where we got west all the time, we got to Custer Battlefield all the time. I was as obsessed as a kid could be with Custer. And Minnesota winters are something. And on a typical Saturday, I could curl up with Margaret Leighton's Custer biography or Reynolds's Custer biography, and I would read them. This week I'd read that book, and then next week I'd read that book, and then I'd read them again and again and again. I just grew up that way. Television, when you could watch on a Saturday morning some old Western, Rio Grande, some old cavalry Western, that was just inspirational to me. When I'm playing with my neighborhood pals, we weren't playing Cowboys and Indians, and we weren't playing Davy Crockett. We were playing cavalry and Indians, and I was the cavalryman, and I had troopers behind me, and we're chasing some enemy someplace. That's how I grew up, and that's how, and I just obsessed over this stuff. And my inspiration for reading are those kind of books, but this military stuff, Crazy Horse, the early Buffalo Bill, and then visiting these places as well. I just grew up, and then and then you become a collector. No, heaven's sakes, don't become a collector, because you start buying books.
A little late for that advice.
Yeah, no, I know, for all of us, isn't it? And you start collecting this stuff. You get to the battlefield, and you get, well, I don't have that one, and if I couldn't afford it, my parents would buy it for me, and I still have all those things. And you'd go home and you'd read this stuff and just swallow, and then you want to work there. And that's when you in my case, you learn about summer jobs and all that. And I had great aspirations to work there, as I said, I explained, and it didn't work, but a better world worked. So
there's a interesting museum connection to Dr. Fees visiting the Alamo, where he became enamored of Davy Crockett's bloody vest that was on display. A beaded vest, and he dreamed about it at night. He thought about it constantly. The very blood of Davy Crockett on the beaded, I think it was Ojibwe vest that he wore. And then years later,
Western History Association.
We were in San Antonio. We go to the Alamo together, and he said, "You've got to see this. It's Davy Crockett's bloody vest." And we go there, and I said, Davy Crockett never wore anything like this. This is, Northern Great Lakes, Indian vest.
But the thing is, here's the real charm. It was at exactly the same spot.
Never been moved. With the little paper label
the labels
that they
were
had.
curling up.
Yeah.
And you had to wipe the dust off the tree.
Blood that had so enthralled him as a child was because they had stapled it to a board and it had rusted. So this is like Museum 101. This is just the worst possible display. And, one of the daughters of the
Texas Revolution.
The Republic of Texas had given it and anything. And the Alamo in those days, and it was all in the church itself, was kind of Granny's attic. They're doing a huge $500 million restoration of the grounds, and it's really incredible what they have now in the museum. It's entirely professional, but let's just say, bless those ladies, they saved the Alamo. And that's the only reason it's there today. But they were not using the best museum.
No.
And Davy Crockett's bloody vest is gone. It's not on display anymore.
Well, it probably never belonged to Davy Crockett, as you mentioned.
Well, of course it didn't.
It had been given to the Alamo by citizens of one of the towns in Tennessee associated with Davy Crockett because they thought the Alamo should have something from there. So it never had a connection with Davy Crockett. But that didn't matter. In fact, what 6 or 7-year-old reads labels doesn't matter.
Yeah, what's the rust?
It's the thing. It's the thing. The bullet holes were moth holes, but the thing and a story to go with the thing is what matters.
That's what matters.
That's what makes museums so very special.
Well, speaking of how stories matter, we're going to take a quick break, thank our sponsors, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit about these bestsellers, Sitting Bull's War by Paul Hedren and The Undiscovered Country by Paul Andrew Hutton, And at some point, I might share with you all my anecdote of Davy Crockett growing up in Los Angeles, California.
Well, thank you, gentlemen cowboys. The stories just keep rolling on. And we have a special event coming up this week. Make sure you will step back in time with Sharlot M. Hall as your guide. Join us for an elegant afternoon of poetry and music that revives the spirit of Prescott's cultural past. The performance is a reimagining of the fundraiser Sharlot M. Hall hosted on January 15th, 1907. More than a century later, that evening of music, dancing, and poetry, it comes to life again on the same stage, celebrating Charlotte's dream of preserving Arizona's history for future generations, years before her vision of a museum would be realized in 1928. Today, Jody Drake, portraying Sharlot herself in her final performance as Sharlot M. Hall, carries the vision forward as both performer and director, bringing this chapter to a meaningful close. So join Jody with local favorites with accompanying music that adds a special touch to the event. Held in the beautiful Elks Theater, this recreation echoes the 1907 performance, which, according to the Prescott Journal-Minor, celebrates in entertaining form the customs of pioneer days. So experience Sharlot M. Hall's dream reborn on stage, an unforgettable event where history and performance meet. VIP and box seating includes an intimate post-performance reception with the cast at the Hassayampa Inn, offering a chance to mingle and celebrate this historic occasion. Go to the museum, go to the website, charlottehallmuseum.org, and purchase your tickets, and it sounds like it'll be a wonderful evening. We'll see you there.
Welcome back to Arizona Roundup with Stuart Rosebrook at Sharlot Hall Museum. We are in Prescott, Arizona today with special guests Paul Hedren of Omaha, Nebraska, and we are talking about his new bestseller, Sitting Bull's War. Andrew Hutton from Cody, Wyoming, the undiscovered country on the New York Times bestsellers list, and Paul Fees, our deputy director here at Sharlot Hall Museum. And what brought us together here today is a love of the American West, a love of history. Our good friend Marv Kaiser, who has helped bring our good friends Paul Hedren and Paul Hutton to Prescott this weekend, and Paul Fees as well.
Originally.
That's right. And you know, when we were talking before this, we were sharing some stories about books that inspired us. I do want to find time over the next few months to get you all on the phone regularly and talk about Western writing, Western publishing. I believe that there is a series of of biographies that we all read. I'm 10, 12 years apart from all of you. I'm 62. But the series of books published in the 1950s, I read Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, Buffalo Bill, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Custer, on and on. There's a whole series.
Mad Anthony Wayne.
A whole series of these biographies that you start reading in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade, and you go and get them from the library, and then you read them again, and you get them. And they are just inspiring stories about a lot of what you talked about last night, Paul Hutton, about the values and just at the heart of a good story, but good stories about people that can inspire you in your life, about our country, about giving it your best for your country. And I think one of the stories that was repeated throughout many of those scholarly books was, they were morality stories about maybe Kit Carson runs away from home and becomes a hero of the American West, and he overcomes the travails. Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Black Hawk was one of my favorites. Chief Joseph. These are all stories that informed us and inspired us to want to know more, to go to those places, to walk where history happened, and to write about it. And last night I was very inspired by both of you. Paul Hedren, when did you decide that you were going to start writing the story from the Lakota perspective? And you grew up in Sioux Country.
Well, I grew up in Sioux Country. I've traveled widely in Sioux Country. You read landscapes like you read books. I preach this all the time. And I just obsess when I'm out on the landscape to go to the places where things happened. And I mean, whether it's the battlefield that I care so much about, or a burial place, or a ravine, or a draw over here because something happened. It affected the way a story plays out. And I've always cared about that sort of thing. In the case of this book, there's several ways I answer that question. I open the book with a Carl Sandburg poem that was it touched me deeply. My family visited the Theodore Roosevelt National Park in my days at Fort Union, living in Williston. And the ranger that night recited this poem, Buffalo Dusk. And it spoke to buffalo and it spoke to Indians and how neither are living the old life anymore and what happened. And it just was, and I've never forgotten the poem, and I use it here and I reference it here. I just have always cared about that sort of thing. To get specific to this book, as I explained last night at our presentation to the Prescott Westerners, there's kind of a rap on people that have done work like we do, of an earlier generation anyway, that we're very good at telling a top-down story and very good about playing out the military side of this story. The sources just are so abundant, and it's an easier story to tell. And to tell a little Bighorn story, you would read in that kind of literature of a different generation, where Reno was and where Yates was and how many men they led and where they fell. And we know the names of those casualties and we know where they're buried. And the opponents were I always thought, rather shallowly presented. Sitting Bull's name was always there. Crazy Horse's name was always there. But the authors never paid a great heed to, and just why were they there? And little things like that it got to me. And as I was taking on and telling parallel stories before this one, I worked very hard to introduce the other side, to introduce Indians to these military stories, these two battle stories I did, for instance, just before this book. And why were they there? How were they there? How did they get to that place at that moment in time when something dramatic or tragic happened? And it occurred to me as I was writing my Powder River book and I was writing my Rosebud book, the Indian, in those books, I devote half the books to the Indian side of the story. And the sources are different, but they're there. And for historians, you can find this material and utilize it. And I worked very hard at that. And it dawned on me as I was writing what is a continuum of an Indian story in 1876, through the Powder River story, through the Rosebud story, that story continued. And in the Rosebud book, I really imagined carrying that story, to the eve of the Little Horn. And, well, that was beyond the purposes of the Rosebud book, and I stopped, but I never lost the thought. And as that book is in press, I'm already imagining picking that story up and now telling the rest of the story.
Did you realize that it was going to be that most people would see this as a biography of Sitting Bull with the title? I mean, it's a beautiful title, and in the cover, this haunting photograph of Sitting Bull himself. I mean, you cannot stop looking at the cover when you walk past it. It captures you and brings you into the book.
My editor saw the same thing as I did. We both agreed independently that this is the picture that I wanted and we both congratulated each other for our brilliance in concluding this. And he's the central figure in this story because he was the rallying figure in that broader story. And I do a nice job, I believe, of introducing him to readers. As I explained last night, and to any audience, I really do try to tell a story. This is now an Indian story. This isn't a military story. And I try to tell the story through Indian eyes because sources are there that enable you to do that. And with Indian voices, there are Indian voices on virtually every page of the book because sources are there that enable you to do that. And I carry the story. I make a big story. You can make a war story out of it, and it's a year and a half story in 1876 and 1877. Well, there was a setup to this story, and there is an aftermath to this story, and I carry through all of that as well. It's a story that's, you read the book, and you'll very quickly you'll discover it's a tragic story. It doesn't end well. I don't deal with the reservation era more than I get those people to the reservation. And what comes later is just horror upon horror again and again. But it was it was a war, and then it was starvation. It was a refusal to submit until there was no choice. As Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, they all said, for the sake of the children, they need to be fed. They couldn't sustain themselves on the prairie any longer. The military are hounding them endlessly. For the sake of the children, we need to come in. And they did.
Well, it's really a very moving book, Paul. And what's interesting to have you and Paul Hutton here together, two colleagues, two friends for decades, and with two books coming out almost at the same time, just a couple months apart, with The Undiscovered Country, Triumph, Tragedy, and The Shaping of the American West. These are two that really should be read together, because I know Sitting Bull plays a strong role in your book and the Custer story, Paul Hutton. But you bring the arc of the American story west, as you talked last night about Frederick Jackson Turner, and I'm hearing also the other colleagues of all of ours here in the Western genre, the new American West, the new thesis brought about of standing where history happened, walk where history happened, and standing there and saying, how did we get here? I love the intersection of the way both of you write and research and the influence of the scholars who have written our history of the American West the last 125 years, the intersection of those influences on both of you, and why I think both of them are so important to read, and they should be read together. They should be read back to back. The Undiscovered Country, Paul Hutton, really, I hope both of you have many books past these, but this is a culmination of 50 plus years, 60 years of your thought on the West, Paul Hutton, in The Undiscovered Country, that provides another viewscape, another view. There's very few books published like this in the catalog of American history, not just the genre of Western American history. And I would say, Paul Hedren, the one thing that in the decade plus I've done at True West as book editor is I think it's important for us to step back and also say that these are important American history books, not just the Western genre. They do cover the Western genre, but to understand America, you have to understand what you've written about in The Undiscovered Country, Paul Hutton, and your biography here on Sitting Bull's War and the Lakota People, Paul Hedren.
Well, I certainly wanted to tell American history, and so the book is a book of American history because I believe the story of America is the story of the American West, and certainly the first epoch. This doesn't mean that colonial history isn't important. This doesn't mean that slavery isn't important. The Civil War is important. Great waves of immigration that are going to come into the country are important. Of course, they all are. Industrialization, urbanization. But in terms of the shaping of the American character and how we saw ourselves as a people, and then as the rest of the world saw us as a people. The story of the American West is central. Frederick Jackson Turner said, don't look at the East Coast, you know. It's the Great West that is the place where the story of America begins. And of course his thesis was that across successive frontiers, as America moved west, we reinvented ourselves as a people. And of course people were coming in from all over, although up to 1890 it still was very much a Anglo-Saxon, you know, movement to the west. And of course it's a two-sided story because there are already people there. And The Undiscovered Country, in fact, is a nod to Hamlet. It's his soliloquy, and he's contemplating suicide. He's contemplating death. What is the undiscovered country? And the story of the West is a story of triumph. It's also a story of tragedy, and so it's a story of death, you know. And so that's what I was getting at. But I also felt that we make new discoveries wherever we go. I haven't been to Paris. If I was to go to Paris, it's an undiscovered country. I don't know anything. I hadn't seen it, you know. And the centrality of discovery to the American people and the American character is so essential to our formation as a unique people, an exceptional people. And some people would say, well, exceptional, what does that mean? Does that mean we're better than everyone else? No, it just means we're different. And why are we different? Why are we different from the Europeans, the Africans, the Asians, you know, the Australians? I mean, and part of that is because we are a hybrid people made of all sorts of folk from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, and they all went west. And so I wanted to tell that story, and I wanted to use a kind of unique structure. I wanted to use lives, and so I picked 7 characters, 4 of them very famous frontiersmen: Boone, Crockett, Carson, Cody, the native leaders, Red Eagle, who was the leader of the Creek Indians in the War of 1812, Mangus Colorados, who united the Apache bands against the American advance, and Sitting Bull, who made the last stand of the Lakota against the Americans. And I wanted to tell the triumph and the tragedy, thus the title. I listen to movie soundtracks when I write, and one of my favorites is Alfred Newman's How the West Was Won, and I'm writing away, and I write by hand on yellow pads, and I'm scribbling away, and suddenly I have an epiphany, and I realize, oh my God, I'm writing that movie, How the West Was Won, except I'm including the other side in it, and that's why the biographical approach was, I think, so important. And I chose the people for the biographies also based on geography, because I had to do chronology from 1755 with Braddock's defeat, where both George Washington and Daniel Boone were present, along with Daniel Morgan and many others that would later be important in American Revolutionary history, all the way to the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. So the book is bookended by 2 battles, or in the last case, a massacre. And I especially wanted to show in the early portions of the book, because the first third of the book is east of the Mississippi River. I want to show the connection between the American Revolution and the very birth of the country, and the nation. And so the West played a central role in the Revolution. And Daniel Boone is such an important character, although George Washington kind of took over some of those early chapters. It's odd, in fact, that Amazon lists the book in their, when you're checking your numbers on Amazon, it's in the American Revolution section. It's like, there I am with McCullough and Jill Lepore, and it's like, I didn't quite expect that to happen, but in retrospect, of course it did, because so much of the book deals with the Revolution and shows how central the conflict in the West was to the victory in the Revolution, but also how it brought on the Revolution. And then, of course, Daniel Boone is the American Moses leading the people into the Promised Land. Davy Crockett then takes on his mantle in the War of 1812 as a symbol of the West, becomes a famous hunter, and as Boone was, and Indian fighter, and then becomes a national celebrity and is elected to Congress, serves 3 terms in Congress, where he finally sacrifices his political career in defense of Indian rights, because he felt the removal of the 5 civilized tribes to the Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma, was a great crime against humanity. He spoke out against it, and it ended his career, and he told his constituents, "You can all go to hell. I'm going to Texas." And they said, "Well, go right ahead. That sounds like hell to us." And
they weren't wrong.
That is not true, as you well know, as you have ancestors who were
There's a lot of Texas connections.
related to my wife, in fact, which is a bizarre connection. Her family were engaged in horse thievery, and his family were engaged in the law, and so they met in the past.
In the hill country of Texas.
In the hill country of Texas, but we digress.
Lone Star State Tales.
Yes, and Crockett, of course, goes to the Alamo, which was a very bad personal choice. But
In his beaded vest.
He did not wear his beaded vest, but his whatever he wore became quite bloody. And this was a great legend choice because, of course, from the ashes of the Alamo rose a great battle cry, a great legend. And, of course, when Americans marched off to the halls of Montezuma in the Mexican-American War, they were still remembering Davy Crockett and the sacrifice at the Alamo for American liberty. And he was followed, and in the War of 1812, Red Eagle led the Creek Indians against him, and I go into great detail about Creek culture. And in fact, I have one chapter called The Council Fire, another chapter called The Hearth, and I use them to compare the kind of pioneer life, with native life. And what you find are many similarities. And Crockett, Boone, Carson, even Cody, all realized that they had something more in common with native peoples than they did with the people in the East that were bringing on these conflicts, and this was very important in their lives. And Kit Carson, in fact, then took that mantle of the frontier hero and ran off as a kid, did a Huck Finn, went off on the Santa Fe Trail, became a mountain man, became the scout for Fremont that opened up the Oregon Trail, then with Fremont helped to conquer California in the Mexican-American War, carried the first dispatches announcing the gold strike in California that was going to change not just the West, but America and, in fact, the world. And then went on to be a famous Civil War soldier fighting against the Texas invasion of New Mexico, and then a famous Indian fighter, which is quite controversial down in the Southwest. Really a fascinating character who's like the Forrest Gump of the American West. He's everywhere. And
his life is not, he does not live he lives a full life, but he does not live to the maturity of like Buffalo Bill. I mean, his life dies. He dies very suddenly. He
dies quite young from an aneurysm that he'd suffered in a fall from a horse. And, at one time, he was one of the most famous Americans who ever lived, but his reputation has kind of slipped over the years. As many of these American heroes that we read about in children's books growing up have all now been condemned by the academic establishment, and who view them as not worthy of being role models for children. And I confess that my story is quite romantic about them, but it's not covering up the flaws that mark their lives. Mangus Coloradus led the Apaches in that struggle. He knew Carson well, and they didn't fight each other, but they were alive at the same time. And he united the Apaches against the American advance in the Southwest, was betrayed by the whites and murdered under a white flag. And then Sitting Bull, of course, would eventually meet the same fate, leading the last Lakota resistance against the American advance. I tell his story, and then remarkably, of course, after he comes back from Canada, he goes into the show business, and he's with Buffalo Bill in Cody's famous Wild West extravaganza, Rough Riders of the World. And so that's a beautiful connection. And then, of course, I tell the story of Sitting Bull's also being essentially murdered. It was a setup. And Cody was horrified by this and denounced it at murder at the time. And Cody's the last figure, and Cody's the real deal. He was a Pony Express rider. He was a buffalo hunter. He was a scout for the 5th Cavalry when he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. And then he was discovered, not by Hollywood, but by the Eastern Stage. In 10 years he was on the boards, and then he couldn't be contained by the stage, and he created his Wild West extravaganza, which toured the world for 25 years and established for Americans who they were and what the story of the West was, and also for Europeans. And his show was so successful that it sort of triumphed in Europe and still remembered, today in Germany and France and England. I mean, where Buffalo Bill, in some ways, was a bigger hero than he was.
One of the greatest celebrities of all time.
Certainly the most famous American of his time. And he dies in 1917. And when he dies, it's like a great page of American history was closed. And Americans now look forward to a steel and steam world of great power politics, and we would march on to the world stage, and that's a whole new epoch of American history. But when Cody dies, that's the end of that first great period of history, and it's a great way, I think, to tell the American story.
Well, we're going to take one last break here, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk a little bit about why these books are important to read this year as we prepare to celebrate America's 250th, July 4th, 2026. People priming themselves to look back and gain a greater understanding of our history as a country. And I'd like to come back in our final segment here and talk about 2026 and how our listeners can begin planning on how to walk where history happened, what they should be reading, where they should be thinking about traveling to, and how to celebrate this 250th anniversary of the United States of America.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, thank you for being with us. The stories still have to keep on coming. My name is Stan. I'm the radio man who helps put this program together. I was pleased when Stuart Rosebrook said we're going to do things differently, and he became one of the first to actually take the Western museums and actually start doing a podcast, and they are turning out to be some of the best and appreciated podcasts in the country. Great stories, great times, and they combine that with performances and events, and in a very special way involve supporting the community as the community supports the museum. So thank you very much for doing that. Remember, this would be a time to think about maybe an annual gift or a gifting session, or just say, I'll help out when I can, but we want to be supportive. And perhaps you want to explore the membership opportunities that are available to you so you can enjoy the museum all through 2026. So why don't you check those things out? Again, charlottehallmuseum.org, charlottehallmuseum.org. And many thanks to the fine men and women who make the museum work and make it happen. And of course to the many sponsors who make all of these events and programs. Indeed, Prescott is the mile-high cowboy city, everybody's favorite hometown.
Welcome back to Arizona Roundup with Stuart Rosebrook at Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona. And we've been having a wonderful afternoon around the table here with Paul Hedren, Paul Andrew Hutton, and Paul Fees. And we've been having a great conversation about writing, about the American West. And I thought that as we close this show, we're approaching here in early January, January 9th, 2026. This is our 250th anniversary of the United States. July 4th, 2026 is going to be celebrated across the country in many different ways. Here in Arizona, we're preparing for the world's oldest rodeo and a Frontier Days that will probably be the largest parade that we've seen here in maybe since the bicentennial. We're going to have a special 4th of July here at Sharlot Hall Museum to commemorate the 4th of July. We're going to have a new exhibit in our center gallery that Paul Fees is directing on the history of Prescott and Arizona. But when we think about travel and all of us, the influence that we all had growing up and where we went as young adults or where our parents took us on the 4th of July and where we've gone as adults with our own families. This is a time for us to start thinking in January about how we want to celebrate, commemorate our history, and where we might be this summer or during the year, or make plans over the next 2 years to go out and stand where history happened, to walk where history happened. And I've been to Little Bighorn once, and my memory is very distinct. It wasn't a very well planned visit, and that's why I think it was so special. That's why I encourage our listeners to not only plan where they're going, but also to allow the opportunity to be surprised at a visit. We drove into Little Bighorn, and I recommend every listener, every American at some point should pilgrimage to Little Bighorn. It's a very special, sacred place. I drove in with my 2 children, who at the time were 14 and 9, and we parked the car. And as we parked the car next to the National Battlefield site, we were living in Iowa City, Iowa at the time, and we had started the day in Red Lodge, and we had to make Theodore Roosevelt that night. So it was early afternoon. We parked the car, and the first cemetery stone we saw was for an Iowa soldier who had fallen in World War II. And we walked over to the museum, which is, of course, my kids knew that that's where we were going to start. But as we got through the museum, I said, you know what, it's time. We have only so much time here before the sun goes down. Let's walk up the hill. Let's walk up to the Last Stand Monument. For me, again, it was one of those moments where I really couldn't believe that I was finally there. This was in 2012, and we had just been celebrating my wife Julie's 50th birthday in McCall, Idaho.
She'll appreciate this. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, she didn't get to go on this trip. She had to fly back and forth as she was working the VA, and I was working for True West, and I was working as a freelance writer and historian. And so I said, I'm going to take the kids on a road trip, and we're going to see some of the West, and we're going to go to Little Bighorn. And so we walked up the hill, and we stayed together and let the kids have their own experience. We separated. We walked here and there, and the kids were like, well, where are we going to go next, Dad? And I said, well, we're going to go over there. And I had noticed that they now had marked the places of the fallen Cheyenne and the fallen Sioux amongst the troopers. And I said, let's go see the Indian monument. I mean, I had published that photograph, that monument, many times in True West magazine. So we walked to the Indian monument, and as we're walking, an Arikara woman and a Northern Cheyenne woman walked up to my 9-year-old daughter and said, let us walk with you. And as we had driven into the monument, and I didn't realize what was happening, we had been stopped by a series of young men in breechcloths on their ponies going to the races just outside the park. And we were there on the anniversary weekend, but it wasn't planned. I just found ourselves there on the anniversary weekend. And the magic was standing back and watching my daughter walk with these 2 women as they started talking to her and telling to her who they were, and then walk with her into the monument and started pointing to the names of their ancestors on the wall. And the sun was going down. It was just one of those moments where you experienced American history as it was happening around you. And to me, that's the magic of Western travel, of being open, not knowing you're actually there on an anniversary date or who you're going to meet, and be open for it. And there was something special, it could be that weekend, it could be another, not an anniversary weekend, but there was just something special as you walked the grounds that day that you felt from your feet up, and you walked away knowing that you had a special moment. And I'm hoping that as we talk about your writings, as historians, all of you, and as we talk about experience history and going out and experience it in person, outside, as Edward Abbey would say, get out of your tin car, feel the sun on your face, feel the rain on your back, take off your shoes, put your feet in the sand of the creek, that our listeners will go out and experience Western history. That's what we are in the business of as public historians. We want people to be inspired by it, to maybe get angry about it, to cry about it, to cheer it, and then go out though and walk where it happened. And so it's very special to me to have you all three here because of what you all have done in your careers. And I just kind of want to go around the table. I'm going to start with Paul Fees. Paul, if you had, someplace right now you think where someone should go this summer, 2 or 3 places, just in brief, where would you send someone to think about American history and experience?
I was just thinking about something entirely different. I'm sorry.
Well, what were you thinking about?
I was thinking about your experience there at Little Bighorn, and how very recent this past we're talking about is. I mean, Paul Hutton's book, The Undiscovered Country, begins very early in our pre-national history, 1755. But it finishes at a time which is almost within our living memory now. And I met, and I know Hutton was with me at the time, and you should have been, Paul Hedren. But we met a woman in England whose father had been with Custer's 7th Cavalry, was wounded in a skirmish in 1868, and had to muster out, and he went back to England. This past we're talking about is so recent that's part of what makes that visit to a place like Little Bighorn or Fort Laramie, makes it so immediate and makes those moments so special. One other little note, this has to do with a visual image that you chose, Paul Hedren, for I assume you chose, that it could have been your editor, but I can remember talking with Alvin Josephi years ago about the way that Indian Wars battles were always marked in American textbooks or on maps by crossed sabers. And I noticed that on the cover of your book, Sitting Bulls wore their crossed hatchets, crossed tomahawks. So I think that's really a big step forward in the retelling of the story. But that's off the topic, and I'm sorry. I'll pass it along to. I grew up in the West. I was born and grew up in the West, and went to a lot of these places that both Paul Hutton and Paul Hedren had to make long trips to see, and from southern Arizona to Colorado, where I spent part of my childhood, it wasn't just such a big trip to come to those wonderful places that we're talking about.
Well, and I wanted to segue, though, also talking about Paul Hedren's cover with this just dramatic portrait of Sitting Bull to Paul Hutton's book with this beautiful painting, which to me, for those, for all of us, when we finally have a chance to travel somewhere, to stand there, to drive and say, stop the car, or take the picture out of the window, it's paintings. Tell us this. The painting on the cover of Undiscovered Country, Paul Hutton, is one of those great paintings that's at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, correct? Buffalo Bill Museum?
That is correct. It's a painting by Irving Bacon, who was actually hired to do paintings by Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody had a very clear vision of how he wanted to control his image and the story of the West. I think this is Bacon's best painting. It's a metaphorical painting as the Indians look from a hill as the buffalo are being pushed forward by wagon trains that are coming in the distance, and Buffalo Bill, of course, is leading the wagon trains. And it is about, discovery and destruction at the same time.
But it's artwork like this that I know as a boy. I walked into a museum and you see that painting, like a great photograph by Timothy O'Sullivan. You say, I want to go there.
Yeah, you want to go there.
Or I want to know what inspired the to me the intersection of art and writing and poetry and photography and teachers brings us to travel, wanting to know more or wanting to be historians. And whether both of these dramatic images on your books, without even opening the cover, make you say, I want to know more.
Well, you
I
certainly
want to be there. I want to know who that is.
As an author, you certainly want people to be enchanted by the cover and then open the book to see what's inside, because it's your gateway. It's your gateway.
Well, of course it is.
You know, Fees was talking about how recent all this past is, and so you take your children to Little Bighorn, as it's called now. It used to be called Custer Battlefield, but of course his name was stripped from the battlefield. And I was appointed by the Secretary of the Interior as one of the members of the Indian Memorial Commission that established that Indian memorial that you and your children went and saw. And then I was a jury member of the jury that selected the actual design of the monument. And, you know, I'm getting along in years, but I'm not that old. And so this reconstruction of the past, a place like Little Bighorn, to acknowledge that it was both sides, you know, of a conflict. And I say very much like the American Civil War. I'm not a party to this. We need to tear down all these monuments. You know, I think we need to leave them up, and then we need to discuss them. And so the Indian Wars are very much an American Civil War, and that's what this whole book that I wrote is about. And so erecting that monument, and we worried about it at the time. You know, will people accept this? You know, on both sides, will Native peoples accept this? You know, and we toured through all of Indian country, and we met on the various reservations with tribal leaders to discuss this. Many of them were opposed to it, and the commission itself was made up by distinguished Native scholars and artists. Arthur Amiot was one, and was majority Native, but even they were worried about it. And interestingly, there was much discussion between the members of the commission from the various tribes over whose names would be on the monument. And there was an opposition to having the Arikara names on the monument because they were fighting with the cavalry against the Lakota. But anyway, all that worked out, and the monument has been a huge success. And people go and they see that, and then they go to Last Stand Hill, which is one of the most haunted places in America. You stand there and you look at these markers, even though they're not exactly in the right place, and there's too many of them, but you look at them and you go, oh my God, what that last desperate moment, these last stands like the Alamo and Custer speak to us, and it speaks to our own sense of mortality. We all, you know, we're all in the Alamo. None of us are getting out of here alive. But they are confronting it, you know, in their youth, and it's just this incredible moment. And you see the little, you know, huddled group there on Last Stand Hill, you know, with Custer in the center, and it's like, wow, you know, something really powerful, you know, happened here, and it changed the world, and it certainly changed the destiny of the Lakota, and it changed the destiny of the United States as well. And here on our 250th anniversary, I hope we can celebrate both sides of that story. That's what I try to do in my book. I mean, it's a celebration of, and the 250th should be a celebration. There's no need for hand wringing. There's need for discussion, because that's what these monuments are supposed to tell us. You know, whether it's a monument to Abraham Lincoln or, you know, Stonewall Jackson. Why is that there? Why would people erect that? You know, same at Little Bighorn. Why is the Cavalry Monument there? Why is the Indian Memorial Monument there? And why was the Indian Memorial erected in Paul Hutton's lifetime when the Custer thing was put in? You know, 100 years before. Something's going on here, and so that's part of the story of America. That's
Well,
part
for
of
good or ill, we're in an experiment, and those are all part of what's happened, part of the cauldron in which the experiment has been worked out, and that's part of what makes that recent history of ours so astonishing and so real. Back to the original question, where would you go? I think the important thing is to, freeway might get you there, but get off the freeway and drive the 2-lane roads to see the grasslands and to see the mesa lands and the canyon lands and the badlands and the Pacific coast too. My goodness, the West is such a miraculous and spectacular landscape. And as Paul Hedren was saying, try to read that landscape. You can visualize what happened and what the trials were, the people who found themselves on it, trying to deal with it. And it also I was reminded by something that Paul Hutton said about when he was talking about his title, The Undiscovered Country. One of the refrains that you come across time and again when you read the diaries and accounts of people who are watching their relatives head off to the West, it's as if they're falling off the end of the world. They are going off. They're dead to us. We'll never see them again. It's so far out there. And
the charm of our story, especially at Little Bighorn, the great anxiety that Paul Hutton was talking about as they were contemplating and then erecting an Indian memorial, so late in that saga, but so deserved at that place, is that that's all past. And the monument, the new monument has been exceptionally well accepted by the American. The American public gets it.
Well, it's remarkable. It's what you see at Gettysburg, and it should be.
It's the way it should be.
Feel it in when you're standing there.
Yeah, no, clearly so. The charm. We're talking 2 segments of American history here, and this is 250th anniversary of our country. But in the case of some of this occurring in the West, and particularly playing it to the story that I wrote, that's 150th. We're looking at the 150th anniversaries of these episodes, and which itself are going to be wonderful lures this summer. You know, people want to be there. Hutton and I were on the battlefield at the 100th anniversary and the 125th anniversary, and I will, by golly, be there at the 150th anniversary. There just are special places and special times in which to visit these places. There's no bad time, but boy, when you can be there at an anniversary, as we're looking at right now, it's going to be a wonderful time.
At dawn.
And then it's only a 2-hour drive to Cody, Wyoming, in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, a 5-museum complex that will absolutely inform and entertain all the visitors.
Listen, more than there's a truism there, because as we know at Little Bighorn Battlefield, they're building a new visitor center.
That's right.
And we are being assured by the National Park Service that the building will be up. But I'll bet you $1 to a donut there's not going to be anything but some temporary visuals on the inside. The books will be available inside. But
so that's a good reason for going.
Well, amen. But there will not be an exhibit gallery inside, because that's a design process that's still well underway but it will not be completed. Making a place like the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, when it is so close, such a logical thing to do, because some of the rest of the story in that tangential way plays there.
Well, we're going to make a promise here to come back regularly over the next 6 months. As you all, both Paul Hedren and Andrew Hutton, are on the road and at home, I'd like to bring you back this regularly. And I will call you, and we'll be on this podcast and talk a little bit about how your book is selling, but also about American history and how to celebrate America's 250. What's happening at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, what's happening at our national parks, and let's bring our readers a little bit closer to taking the road west, coming to Prescott, Arizona, putting it on their map as they travel to celebrate America and learn more about this great country and our people. That's it for today on Arizona Roundup from Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona. Thank you to my guest, Paul Andrew Hutton.
Thank you.
Paul Hedren.
Thank you very
much. And
kindly.
Paul Fees. And, of course, thank you for Mark Kaiser bringing us all here together today.
Indeed so.
Happy New Year.